The day is September 10th, 2001.
Monday, September 10th, 2001.
Michael Jackson is trying to make a
10th,
comeback.
2001.
Defense Secretary Donald Rumsfeld's just downed his 7th cup of coffee in less than 1 hour. He needs it to calm his nerves for what he's about to do next, otherwise he might blow this. Gathering his stack of papers, Rumsfeld takes swift steps to the press briefing room as a light perspiration begins to bubble up above his left eyebrow. Now at the podium, Rumsfeld clears his throat and drops a bombshell.
Our financial systems are decades old. According to some estimates, we cannot track $2.3 trillion in transactions.
Yes, you heard right. According to the military, $2.3 trillion somehow just grew wings and flew away, and they just didn't know where it went. Now, trillion is a pretty difficult number to visualize instinctively, so let me give you some perspective. If you were to start spending $1 every second, it would take you about 12 days to finish $1 million. For $1 billion, it would take about 32 years. Now, guess how long it would take you to finish $1 trillion at the rate of $1 per second? 31,000 freaking years! And the Pentagon didn't even lose just $1 trillion. It lost $2.3 trillion. So of course Americans were royally pissed and ready to burn the entire Pentagon down after they heard the news. But then, just before anyone could lift up their pitchforks and torches, the worst disaster in the history of America struck. The very next day after Rumsfeld's announcement, the World Trade Center, which happened to house the financial offices of the Pentagon, went up in flames. Coincidence? Many say not. In fact, many conspiracy theorists continue to point to the convenient timing of Rumsfeld's announcement as proof that 9/11 was not a terrorist attack, but an inside job. And not to put on a tinfoil hat, but I do see where they're coming from. Still, is this really how the Pentagon lost all that money? Over the next few minutes, we'll go down this rabbit hole to find out the truth behind the missing trillions. Obviously, we'll talk about what 9/11 really has to do with all this, but we'll also talk about the Pentagon's creative ways of doing math. Why its toilet seats cost $10,000, hint, it's price gouging, and how Congress makes all this madness possible with our money. Now, before we go on, I should warn you that this whole missing $2.3 trillion shebang wasn't a one-off thing. Oh, far from it. It's a tradition over at the Pentagon. Just like people set off fireworks every 4th of July, our military misplaces trillions of dollars every year. You'll see what I mean in a minute.
Another year gone by, another Pentagon audit.
6th year in a row now and counting, the Pentagon has failed its yearly audit.
At this point, it's no longer a surprise when the Pentagon fails an audit. In fact, it's a culture by now and everyone just expects it. In 2023, the department failed its 6th audit in a row, which is quite alarming because the Pentagon's budget for last year was about $740 billion. That's $750 billion, which makes the agency the federal government's largest spender hands down. As a matter of fact, the Pentagon gets half of all taxpayer money that Congress approves every year. And yet, for many, many years, it didn't even have to account for all that money. It was all just, hey, we got your money and we spent it.
That the United States has spent over $5.9 trillion on defense since 9/11, while failing an audit of the Defense Department, which was the first audit in that agency's history.
It wasn't until 2018 that the D.O.D., for the first time ever, started running audits. But did this change anything? Quit playing, of course it didn't. Year after year, while every other federal department produces clean audits, the Pentagon keeps promising to ace its audits while simultaneously managing to lose trillions. For instance, in 2018, the Pentagon had zero paper trail for over $800 million that had been allocated to construction projects. By 2023, that figure ballooned to about $1.9 trillion, more than the entire federal government budget for that year. It makes you wonder why Congress keeps approving trillions of dollars in Pentagon spending. I mean, it makes absolutely no sense. Everyone knows that if someone shows irresponsibility with money they're given, the logical thing to do is to stop giving them money, or at least reduce how much you give them till they learn some responsibility and accountability, right? Textbook stuff. Except for Congress. It's the polar opposite. Since the Pentagon started failing its audits in 2018, Congress has approved over $3 trillion in Pentagon spending. It's like Congress is rewarding the D.O.D. for losing all our money. The Pentagon claims that it will take them decades to get their house in order just because of its mammoth size. But that's a load of bull because Veteran Affairs and Homeland Security are ginormous. Maybe not as large as the D.O.D, but still large enough to be making the same excuse as the Pentagon, and still, they don't. Now, you're probably wondering why our military continues to fail its audits. Well, the popular answer you'll hear is that it can't keep track of its property. The real answer, however, centers on the incestuous relationship between Congress and the D.O.D. To really understand the gravity of this messed up situation, though, you need to see how deep the rot goes in the Pentagon. And there's no better place to begin than the Pentagon's budget-fixing superpowers, plugging and nippering. Alright, so it's March 2000.
In Russia today, the clear winner of the Russian presidential.
We've already seen the markets down by about 12%, a little more than that.
This is the 72nd Annual Academy Award.
By the way, save this date for later. American Beauty is about to sweep the Oscars, and Amazed by Lone Star is topping the Billboard 100. Meanwhile, back at the Pentagon, absolutely no one is on top of the books, and money is missing everywhere. It's so bad that the military's accountants have to adjust their calculations by a whopping $7 trillion just to make the books add up. In other words, the Pentagon looked at its books, saw that there were huge accounting errors, and then instead of working to find out where the missing money went, they just wrote a bunch of huge rubbish numbers to balance the books. These guys even have a term for it. It's called plugging. Actually, there are two terms, plugging and nippering. Plugging is pretty self-explanatory, like plugging a leaking hole. Nippering, on the other hand, is Pentagon slang for shifting money from its authorized purpose to a completely different purpose. And sometimes this nippering is done so many times, it becomes virtually impossible to trace the money in the first place. But of course, don't just take my word for it. A budgeting veteran at the Pentagon said this himself. Obviously, he insisted on anonymity since he didn't want to lose his job. Now, these plugs we're talking about can be freaking huge. In 2015, for instance, Congress approved a budget of $122 billion for the US Army. But by the time the DoD's financial report for said year came out, we were seeing plugs of up to $6.5 trillion with absolutely no documentation whatsoever. And it gets even more sinister because the Inspector General's office reported that a lot of the documentation for that plug was removed. What does that even mean? Now, to be fair, the Pentagon wasn't the only agency with bad ledgers in 2013. 13 other big federal agencies were also in bad shape financially. Still, there's missing money and there's missing money. Treasury Department, $17.3 billion. Pentagon, $2.3 trillion. Also, the semi-secrecy around the Pentagon's missing trillions is incredibly suspect. I told you to save that March 2000 date for later, right? Well, here's why. Even though Defense Secretary Donald Rumsfeld publicly announced the Pentagon's missing trillions in September 2001, when we track the dates, we see that the department had actually known about this missing money for close to 2 years before they ever said anything. So, in light of that, is it really crazy for people to suspect foul play when the World Trade Center goes up in flames right after Rumsfeld announces that the Pentagon is missing the most amount of money ever lost by a single entity in financial history? Not like I'm saying that the Pentagon blew up the World Trade Center or anything, but let's look at the surrounding factors. First, the planes crashed into the Twin Towers, but then the World Trade Center, which houses the Pentagon's accounting offices, collapses hours later, even though it wasn't ever hit by a plane. Secondly, the timing was a little too convenient. You lose $2.3 trillion since March of 2000, but then wait till September 2001 to tell everybody, and then under 24 hours later, your account offices explode, and the media's focus completely switches to these dramatic events? Even if you don't care for conspiracy theories, you have to admit that the Pentagon's hands are definitely not clean. Because it's not just about the unbalanced ledgers, it's also about the $10,000 toilet seats, the jets of cash that go poof, the black budgets, the questionable secret missions, the blackmail, all these and more that the Pentagon has succeeded in keeping away from the public. But I'm going to explain all of this to you in a bit because someone has to, so buckle down because it's a lot.
With the U.S. supplying billions of dollars of what can only be described as price gouging by U.S. defense contractors.
Let's begin with this handsome dude, Arthur Ernest Fitzgerald. In the 1980s, Fitzgerald was known as the most hated man in the Air Force, and to know why, we have to go back a couple of decades further.
That's for sure. It's been almost 21 years since I committed truth in revealing to Senator William Proxmire the concealed $2 billion cost overruns on the big C-5A transport plane.
To begin with, this guy was someone you'd call a sleuth for truth, and a straight talker to boot.
We're in the business, particularly in Washington, of distributing favors, patronage to people all over the country, powerful institutions in particular, and anyone who gets in the way of that process with embarrassing truths has violated the Washington's Code of the Hills.
You got in the way, and they did get rid of you.
Sure, yeah.
More than 50 times, the whistleblower called the Pentagon out on the rampant fraud, pork, and cost overruns within the department. For instance, it was through Fitzgerald that America got to find out that the Air Force was paying close to $1,000 for plastic caps for stool legs, when these caps actually cost 34 cents each. It was also through him that we got to know the Pentagon is essentially a powerhouse of waste and spending sprees made possible by our taxes. Fitzgerald's biggest sin, however, happened on November 13th, 1968, the day he testified to Congress that the Air Force's latest fleet of aircraft had exceeded budget by $2 billion. It was the unpardonable sin, and in retaliation, Nixon had him fired. Anyway, Fitzgerald is dead now, but he did leave behind a solid legacy, as well as a solid framework for simplifying the complexities of Pentagon spending, which we're gonna borrow for a second. First, he says, we analyze how the military overprices familiar objects like hammers, toilet seats, and ashtrays. Then we explain how an F-15 or B-1 bomber or M1 is simply a bundle of overpriced spare parts flying in close formation. I mentioned $10,000 toilet covers earlier, and you probably felt I was exaggerating. Unfortunately, I wasn't.
The overpriced plastic toilet seat covers that cost $640 in the 1980s now cost $10,000.
The Pentagon really did spend $10,000 for one plastic ring used to cover a toilet bowl. And no, it wasn't gold-plated, it was really mere plastic. Now, to be fair, these plastic toilet covers are not like the regular ones you have in your home. Aircrafts need special kinds of toilets because urine can cause the plane to rust and get damaged, so we get it. Air Force jets can't be using the same toilet seats as us basic bees. But $10,000 though? It's like flushing money down the toilet, especially when the Pentagon can literally 3D print these things on their own for a much more affordable price of $300 a seat. Come on, this is why the Pentagon has a chief acquisition officer, to negotiate deals with contractors that benefit taxpayers so that you and I get the best possible bang for our buck. Unfortunately, the evidence shows that the Pentagon prefers to be on the side of the contractors, probably because of the blood money they stand to make from these shady deals. With the $10,000 toilet seats, for instance, the Pentagon defended the purchase because, according to them, the contractor in question was being made to produce toilet seats when they had left the toilet seat line. This excuse is so flimsy, I can't even. Another example is when the Pentagon pays a contractor to research and develop a new product, but then doesn't secure the intellectual property rights up front. When this happens, the contractor retains the IP rights, which makes them the only establishment permitted to manufacture and sell said items by law. In other words, the contractor becomes a monopoly. No other company can produce said product. No other company can even maintain or repair said product, which means the contractor can now charge $10,000 for a toilet seat, and we have to bleed out that money whether we like it or not. But it wasn't always like this. Even though the Pentagon has always had accountability issues, back in the 80s there was competition among military contractors, and this meant that the Pentagon had choices and therefore spent less on purchases. But then, in the early 2000s, in a bid to save money, the department did the most counterproductive thing ever in the history of counterproductive things. It laid off over 100,000 employees who were supposed to help negotiate and supervise defense contracts, leaving the contractors to oversee themselves. These guys really felt they could trust the contractors to find it in their hearts to do what's best for their country and not their own pockets. How dumb can you be? How could they not see the price gouging coming from miles away? In the Ukraine war, for instance, it's costing the Pentagon over $400,000 to replace one single shoulder-fired Stinger missile, thanks to Raytheon being the sole supplier of the missile. Guess how much the same missile cost in 1991? $25,000. Yeah, account for inflation and upgrades, I get it. It still wouldn't ever justify a 700% price jump. Contractors are taking the military for a ride because they know the Pentagon will never hold them accountable. I mean, if you're a shareholder in Raytheon or Lockheed or any of those other top military contractors, you must be swimming in a pool of gold coins because these guys are flush with Pentagon money to the tune of tens of billions. A couple of years ago, Army negotiators caught Raytheon exaggerating the cost and number of hours it spent building the radar and ground equipment for the Patriot missile defense system. In 2015, Lockheed Martin and Boeing were caught overcharging the Pentagon by hundreds of millions of dollars for the Patriot PAC-3 missiles, 40% profits. 2012, the F-35 Joint Strike Fighter program that Lockheed Martin should have had ready by 2005 still had not been delivered, even though the budget for it had been overshot by $90 billion. But the best is yet to come, because taxpayers are still going to have to cough up another $1.3 trillion for support and maintenance. So, that's just great. How about wartime? Well, war is good business and a very reliable black hole if you're the spoiled brat of the federal government looking for ways to waste money. During the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, truckloads of cash would literally go missing. For context, because of the war, Iraq and Afghanistan didn't have a functioning banking system. So, the US would fill C-130s with $100 bills about once or twice a month and then fly them to both countries to ensure that operations would carry on as usual. Most of that money vanished into thin air. A combined $608 billion was lost in both countries due to waste, corruption, and plain incompetence. How about billion-dollar projects that the Pentagon suddenly killed out of nowhere? For instance, the Future Combat Systems program that was supposed to produce a fleet of high-tech vehicles. Killed. Why? Systems didn't work. Comanche helicopter that was supposed to be a stealth vehicle for recon and attack? Never built after billions had been invested and 22 years of R&D had been wasted. I could go on and on with these, but you get the point. All told, how much is unaccounted for at the Pentagon in total? Honestly, there's no way to know for sure. You can only guess, seeing as the D.O.D. can't pass an independent audit. We do know, however, that as of last year, $1.9 trillion was unaccounted for in Pentagon spending. And that's just the tip of the iceberg. That's money that the public is allowed to know about. We haven't even talked about the Pentagon spending that is kept secret from the public, aka the black budget.
New tonight, details from a top-secret federal budget dubbed the Black Budget.
A few black budget programs have been declassified, so you may know them. The stealth bomber is one example, also the Navy's tactical fighter, the Milstar satellite, and the Kamikaze Dolphins project, where dolphins were being trained to be underwater kamikazes. Yeah, really? Of course, special ops aren't a bad idea. Our country needs them, but it makes you think, if the Pentagon is wasting money on budgets we have full transparency over, what are they doing with black budgets? Thankfully, I was able to do a little sleuthing, and boy, ever heard of merged surplus account? We'll get to that, but to get there, we have to begin with the Iran-Contra affair. So, it's the second term of the Reagan administration, and 7 Americans are being held hostage by Hezbollah in Lebanon. Manusher Gobanifar, an Iranian arms dealer, approaches the US government and proposes a deal. Sell us some arms, and we could speak on your behalf to Hezbollah to release the hostages. 2 things to note at this point. 1, Hezbollah is backed by Iran, and 2, Iran had been placed on an arms embargo after the stunt they pulled during the Iranian Revolution, where they held several Americans hostage for 444 days. Anyway, the Reagan administration considers the deal and decides that it's not a bad one. At least that way the hostages are released and maybe America and Lebanon could work through their issues. So they take the deal. But they add a little twist. Instead of selling to Iran at the normal price, they'd mark up the price. This way, they significantly increased their profit. Altogether, the weapons America sold to Iran had a real value of $12.5 million, but they sold to Iran for $42 million, thereby walking away with a $30 million profit. Come 1986, a Lebanese newspaper runs a story about the arms deal between the US and Iran, and word finally gets out about what the Reagan government did.
Did the Department of Defense help circumvent Congress and the law as part of the weapons for Contras deal?
So an investigation is launched into the deal only to find out that the $30 million profit was unaccounted for. Where did it go? Well, that sounds sweet and helpful until you realize that the Contras were cocaine kingpins, which was why Congress passed the Boland Amendment in the first place that restricted the involvement of the CIA and the Pentagon in the Nicaraguan crisis. But in the end, surprise, surprise, most of the people involved were just given tiny slaps on the wrist, while the rest were granted presidential pardon by George Bush. Only one person served time, and obviously, since then, not much has changed. Now, this is an off-the-books arms deal that we know about. There are many, many others we don't know about. Maybe even including the US Special Forces activity in the Niger Republic. You know, when the program launched, Congress wasn't actually fully aware of what it was really about. It wasn't until the Special Forces unit got ambushed in 2018 and 4 US soldiers died that they found out what exactly was going on down there.
We now know the mission changed for those 4 soldiers and their team, and tonight wasn't more than the Pentagon, was the CIA involved.
Which begs the question of how the Pentagon funds operations like this without the knowledge of Congress. Well, my friend, that's where the merged surplus account comes in. The merged surplus account is the Pentagon's slush fund, filled with billions, possibly trillions, of illegally appropriated cash. Here's how it works. First, the Pentagon overestimates inflation rates for its weapon systems. Congress approves the money, the D.O.D. makes the purchases. But of course, there's excess cash left, so rather than return the funds to the Treasury, as the law demands them to do, the D.O.D. moves them into the merged surplus account, and this becomes an untraceable source of funding for Black Ops. And the best part is, even though it's technically taxpayer money, it wasn't appropriated by Congress, so the Pentagon doesn't have to give account for how it was spent. That brings us to what I mentioned earlier, the incestuous relationship between Congress and the Pentagon.
While the U.S. spent 20 years fighting land wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, the Pentagon watched China, its greatest geopolitical rival of the 21st century, build the largest navy in the world.
When people try to explain the reason the Pentagon keeps failing its audits, they mention things like the Pentagon's size or its 1,001 ledgers and all the other stuff. But the real truth is more obvious. It's corruption, fraud, waste, abuse. It's things like plugging, nippering, black budgets, and merged surplus accounts. It's how Congress continues to dote on the Pentagon in spite of its massive financial flops. These are the real reasons the Pentagon is impossible to audit. Congress keeps piling on funds for programs and weapons that the Pentagon doesn't even want. Our lawmakers may seem to be holding the Pentagon accountable, but they also give them $15 to $60 billion more than they ask for every year. Probably because a part of that money comes back to them anyway in the form of campaign donations and lobbying money from defense contractors. Unfortunately for all of us, a study carried out a couple of years ago showed that even with all of the money that the US spends on defense, if we go to war against Russia or China today, America will struggle to win. Struggle! The study also showed that America has lost her edge over these two countries both militarily and technologically. This is a military that spends more on defense than the next 10 highest spending militaries in the world combined. I mean, the US spends 12 times more on defense than Russia, and we still might lose to Russia if we go to war today. So, where does that leave us? Well, it leaves us with an annual Pentagon budget that's pure garbage, a paralyzed Congress that can't do a thing about it, and a Department of Defense that's paying lip service to the idea of fixing the situation while demanding even more cash. Nobody wins in this situation. If the Pentagon cannot or will not track its own spending, then how can it identify its inefficiencies? How can it decide where to prioritize spending? How can it make informed budgetary decisions? And ultimately, how can it effectively do its job of defending national security? Little wonder that public confidence in the D.O.D. is dipping every year. In 2018, 70% of Americans had a great deal of trust and confidence in the military. By 2021, that number dipped to 56%, and that's not good for any country because citizens don't just need to be safe, they need to actually feel safe or else we have widespread paranoia. To be fair, a few things have been set up here and there to fix the Pentagon's spending issue. With the Freedom of Information Act that was passed in 2005, citizens can now request records from any federal agency, which could be helpful for increasing transparency at the Pentagon. The DoD is also trying to replace all of its older accounting systems with newer and better ones that are, from this century. They even launched an AI program to help them navigate the concrete jungle that is their financial records. The program is called Game Changer, and it won't just help the Pentagon pass its audits, it could also help the department reduce bureaucratic delays and bottlenecks. Meanwhile, Congress is also considering penalties for failed audits. The Audit the Pentagon Act hasn't been signed into law just yet, but if it is, departments that fail to pass their audits would have to refund 1% of their budgets to the Treasury, which isn't a bad idea. The problem is, even with all these efforts, the DoD still can't say when exactly it's going to be able to start passing its audits finally. It took 30 years before the department would even sit for an audit. Perhaps it's going to take another 30 years before they can pass one. I'll be reading all your comments, and I'm already working on my next video, so if you have any feedback or tips, my ears are wide open. Make sure you subscribe, and thank you for watching.